The Australian Outback is a land of deceptive beauty, a sprawling canvas of ochre that stretches to the horizon. It is a place where the sun doesn't just shine, it punishes, baking the earth until the air ripples with the ghost of 1,000 heatwaves. For those who do not know the secrets held within the red dust, the silence out here might seem peaceful, but for those who have lived in the shadow of the desert, that silence is heavy. It is a silence that guards the forgotten, a sun-bleached tomb where the wind carries the faint whispers of those who walked into the shimmering heat and never walked back out. The Northern Territory is a place of infinite space, yet for many it became a final, cramped destination marked only by shifting sands. Between 1970 and 1990, the heart of Australia was a frontier for drifters, jackaroos, and young travellers looking to lose themselves in the grandeur of the interior. Many did exactly that, but not in the way they intended. Official records are filled with clinical terms like misadventure or exposure. However, there is a recurring legend in these remote parts, spoken of in hushed tones over lukewarm beers in roadside pubs. It is the legend of the disappeared. These weren't just ill-prepared tourists. These were capable men and women who vanished into thin air, leaving behind half-packed bags and unpaid tabs that were eventually wiped clean by the passage of time and the indifference of the law. Nowhere is this mystery more chilling than at Blackwater Station. Situated hundreds of miles from the nearest paved road, the station was once a thriving hub. But one sweltering night in 1984, 3 men, experienced stockmen who knew the land better than their own names, disappeared between the evening meal and the morning muster. No struggle was recorded. No tracks were found. The local authorities arrived days later, conducted a cursory search, and filed a report stating they had likely wandered off during a bout of bush madness. Case closed. But the desert doesn't swallow 3 grown men at once without leaving a trace, unless the desert isn't the one doing the swallowing. Elias spent 30 years in the windowless basements of police archives. Now retired, he lives in a small house on the outskirts of Alice Springs, surrounded by cardboard boxes filled with files that the department deemed redundant. Elias is a forensic archivist who sees patterns where others see chaos. He has a quiet obsession with files that were supposedly lost during floods or destroyed in administrative purges. He doesn't believe in bush madness, and he certainly doesn't believe in the statistical anomalies he discovered while cross-referencing old Northern Territory records with interstate missing person databases. As Elias dug through the yellowed pages, a terrifying discrepancy emerged. The number of missing person reports filed by families during those 2 decades was nearly double the number of official death reports in the Territory's registry. Hundreds of souls were missing from the tally, vanished from the books as if they had never existed. It was as if a demographic hole had opened up, a void that consumed the young and the mobile. Elias realized the official narrative was a lie of omission. Someone had been cleaning the slate, ensuring that the nobodies, the drifters who had no one to look for them, stayed as nobodies. The breakthrough came at 2 in the morning. Tucked inside a mislabeled cold case file was a single grainy Polaroid photograph. It showed a remote patch of scrubland, the red earth freshly disturbed to form a long mound. Parked just a few feet away was a white police cruiser, its door open and its markings clearly identifiable. The date on the back of the photo matched the exact week the 3 men vanished from Blackwater Station. It was evidence of a grave that, according to every official document, never existed. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The photo didn't just represent a body, it represented a betrayal, a hint that the very people sworn to protect the law were the ones burying its victims. Elias knew then that he couldn't stay in his basement any longer. The red sand was calling, and it was time to uncover what the heat had been trying to hide for 40 years. The highway stretched out before Elias like a cauterized vein across the red skin of the continent. Every mile further into the interior felt like a descent into a forgotten century. He drove a battered four-wheel drive, the air conditioning struggling against the suffocating weight of the Northern Territory sun. His destination was the skeletal town that once served Blackwater Station, a place now little more than rusted iron and the echoes of prosperity. As the horizon shimmered with a deceptive haze, Elias understood why secrets stayed buried here. The land was too vast for casual curiosity, and the isolation served as a natural fortress for those who wished to remain unseen. Upon arriving at the ghost town, the silence was guarded and heavy. This was the law of the land, a code where survival depended on loyalty to neighbors rather than to an abstract justice. In these remote pockets of the Outback, the local families didn't see themselves as lawless. They were the only law that mattered. At the top sat the old guard, wealthy families who had carved their empires out of the dust generations ago. To them, the drifters and seasonal workers were merely fuel for their stations, easily replaced and even more easily forgotten. Their influence reached the local police, ensuring that any inconvenient truths remained hidden behind a wall of indifference. Elias found Clara living in a small, weathered shack on the edge of the township. She was a woman who seemed carved out of the very earth she stood upon, her face a map of grief and quiet resilience. Her brother, Thomas, had been one of the three who vanished from Blackwater Station decades ago. Unlike the police who had dismissed his disappearance as a simple case, Clara had never stopped waiting for the truth. Her desperation had crystallized into an unwavering resolve that filled the small room. She invited Elias inside, the air smelling of old paper and peppermint tea. Clara had been conducting her own investigation for years. She produced a bundle of yellowed letters Thomas had sent before he vanished into the dust. In the final few, Thomas spoke of a growing dread and a group he called the Night Patrol. These men moved through the scrub at night, not to check on the cattle, but to monitor the people. They weren't official law enforcement, yet they carried themselves with an authority that suggested they had the blessing of the powerful. Thomas wrote that the Night Patrol was cleaning up the fringes, ensuring that anyone who didn't fit the image of a productive worker simply vanished into the desert. The connection between the Night Patrol and the old guard became clearer as Clara recounted how station owners would meet in secret to discuss regional security. To outsiders, it sounded like a neighborhood watch, but to the workers who lived in the shadows of the massive homesteads, it was a reign of terror. The Night Patrol was the invisible hand of the elite, used to maintain a brutal order that official police chose to ignore. They were the shadows in the dust, valuing land and legacy over human life. Elias and Clara spent hours poring over the documents, but physical proof remained elusive until Clara led him to the back of her property. Beneath the skeletal branches of a dead ghost gum tree, she pointed to a patch of ground that felt unnaturally firm. She told him that years ago she had seen her brother's supervisor burying something in the middle of the night. Elias began to dig, the shovel biting into the sun-baked clay. After several minutes of grueling labor, the blade struck metal. They unearthed a rusted metal container, its hinges fused by heat. Inside were the personal effects of 5 different individuals, watches, wallets, and wedding rings, all of whom were listed in Elias's missing persons files. These weren't lost items. They were trophies. The reality hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. The disappearances weren't accidents, but systemic executions. As the sun dipped, casting long shadows across the earth, Elias knew this container was just the beginning of a darker inventory that the desert was finally yielding. Inside Clara's dim kitchen, the contents of the rusted metal container lay spread like the remains of a broken civilization. Elias handled the items with a slow, surgical precision, but his hands trembled. These weren't just discarded belongings. He found a silver watch with a cracked face, and on its back, a tiny serial number, not a manufacturer's mark, but a government inventory code used by the local police. There was a leather wallet containing a laminated ID card with the unmistakable perforated edge of an official confiscation tag. This wasn't debris of men lost to nature. It was evidence of a bureaucratic processing of death. These men hadn't simply wandered off. They had been detained, their lives itemized, and their histories stripped away before they were buried. The truth hit him like a dry wind. This was a chronicle of systemic execution, a conveyor belt of murder managed by the very authorities meant to protect the peace. The police weren't just negligent, they were providing the labels for the trophies. Elias said his goodbyes to Clara, her eyes mirroring 40 years of silence. He pulled his four-wheel drive back onto the Stewart Highway, the asphalt shimmering like a black river. For hours, there was only the hum of tires and the vast scrub. Then he saw it. In the rearview mirror, a white SUV appeared from the heat haze, maintaining a steady distance. It didn't try to pass, nor did it fade. It was a predator tracking its prey. Every time Elias adjusted his speed, the white spectre mirrored him. The isolation of the Outback now felt like a suffocating trap. There were no witnesses out here, no one to hear a cry for help. The vastness that once offered freedom now offered only a stage for a silent, high-speed execution. As the white SUV loomed, Elias felt the weight of his own past. People often asked why he cared about the nobodies, the drifters and forgotten travelers. They didn't know about the cold cases he'd seen, the names that turned into numbers because no one of importance claimed them. To Elias, a person's existence shouldn't be validated by their bank account. A life lost was a hole in the universe, and leaving those holes unacknowledged was a crime. He couldn't let these men stay forgotten because doing so would be an admission that some lives were worth less than others. He was driven by a quiet rage against the indifference of the wealthy and powerful. He managed to lose his tail by veering onto a dusty track leading toward a derelict shearing shed, waiting until the SUV roared past. There, he met the contact Clara had mentioned, a former station hand named Miller. Miller's skin was like sun-bleached leather, his eyes clouded with fear. He didn't want to talk, but the sight of the confiscation tags broke his resolve. He spoke of the night patrol as a living nightmare. They were the private army of the station owners, men who rode the boundaries at night to clean up anyone who shouldn't be there. They saw the Outback as their private kingdom. The police didn't just turn a blind eye, they provided the tags, the vehicles, and the cold, calculating silence of the law. Miller reached into a tattered coat and pulled out a hand-drawn map, the paper brittle and stained. His finger pointed to remote coordinates near an abandoned opal mine. He called it the Bone Yard. It was the final destination for those the night patrol deemed undesirable. As Miller handed over the map, his hand gripped Elias's wrist with desperate strength. He warned Elias that the people who built that place were still out there, their children now holding the reins of power. They were watching the roads, the phones, and they were watching him. Elias looked at the map, the weight of the discovery settling into his bones. The truth was no longer a ghost. It was a physical location, waiting under the ancient red dust. Elias gripped the steering wheel, the map from Miller resting on the seat like a death warrant. The track narrowed into a jagged line of limestone and clay. This sector of the Northern Territory didn't appear on any tourist brochures. It was a landscape of harsh ridges and scrub that rattled like bone in the wind. The heat was a physical weight, pressing against the windshield and distorting the horizon into a shimmering lake. Elias felt the isolation. He was moving where the law of the state ended and the law of the land began. The further he drove, the more the earth seemed to bleed, the soil turning deep crimson. A dust storm began as a thin veil on the horizon, but soon transformed into a towering wall of ochre. A sudden, violent wind buffeted the vehicle, and the sun was swallowed by a bruised sky. Through the thickening haze, the headlights of the white SUV reappeared, two predatory eyes cutting through the gloom. Elias pushed his engine, the four-wheel drive bouncing over washouts. He navigated by instinct through a maze of identical salt pans and dead trees. He used the storm as a shroud, veering sharply off the main track and cutting his lights. He waited, heart hammering, as the heavy rumble of the SUV passed mere yards from his hiding spot, oblivious in the blinding grit. The silence that followed was broken only by the whistle of sand against metal. When the wind died down, leaving silt over everything, Elias stood before the coordinates. The site was an abandoned opal mine. A series of vertical shafts bored into the earth like scars. The silence here was different. It was heavy and utterly devoid of life. He approached the shaft, his flashlight beam cutting the darkness. At first, he saw only the rusted machinery of a failed industry. Then, as the light traveled deeper, he saw the truth. It wasn't just a grave. It was a factory of disposal. Stretched out across the floor were the remains of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people. The dry desert air had partially mummified some, while others were merely piles of bleached bone. They were arranged with a terrifying clinical order. Elias saw the remnants of clothes, denim jackets, flannel shirts, and the sturdy boots of drifters. The scale of the uninvestigated deaths was staggering. This wasn't the work of a few angry men. This was a generational purge. The boneyard was a testament to a silence bought and paid for over decades. He felt a wave of nausea. These were the people the world had agreed to forget, tucked away in a hole where the sun never reached. He climbed down a rusted ladder to document the scene. Near a stack of skeletal remains, he found a discarded metal clipboard. Clamped to it was a logbook, its pages yellowed but legible. As he flipped through, the names of the night patrol members were listed next to dates. His breath hitched. These weren't just names of station owners. He recognized surnames belonging to a current senator, a police commissioner, and several judges. The conspiracy hadn't ended in the 90s. It had simply matured, its architects now the pillars of the very society they had cleaned through murder. Desperation fueled him as he took photos, the flash of his camera illuminating the hollow eye sockets of the forgotten. Every click felt like a small act of justice. But as he climbed back to the surface, the sound of his breathing was interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic hissing. He ran to his vehicle and found all four tires sagging into the red dirt, the sidewalls slashed with surgical precision. A low growl of an engine echoed across the salt pan. From behind a ridge, the white SUV emerged, moving slowly. It stopped at the edge of the mine, its shadow stretching toward Elias. The driver's door opened, but no one stepped out. The figure remained behind the tinted glass, a silhouette of generational malice. The heat shimmered between them, a silent standoff in the heart of the void. Elias clutched his camera. He had found the truth, but the desert was preparing to swallow him, just as it had swallowed the nobodies beneath his feet. The dust from the earlier storm still hung in the air, a fine grit that tasted of iron and ancient history. Elias stood frozen by his incapacitated vehicle, the rhythmic hissing of his slashed tires, a countdown to a final confrontation. The scent of hot rubber mixed with the smell of old death rising from the shafts below. The silhouette in the white SUV finally moved. A man stepped out, his posture radiating a terrifyingly casual authority. He wore high-end moleskin trousers and a broad-brimmed hat that shaded his eyes, looking less like a killer and more like a man surveying a family empire. This was the descendant of the original night patrol, the heir to a legacy of blood and silence. "You should have stayed in the archives, Elias," the man said, his voice a low drawl that carried easily across the salt pan. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, as if Elias were a stray dog that had wandered into a private garden. He spoke of the Outback as a fragile ecosystem that required constant curation. To him, the drifters and travelers who vanished between 1970 and 1990 were merely parasites that threatened the order established by the great landowning families. The night patrol wasn't a gang of murderers in his eyes. They were the essential gardeners of the desert, pruning human weeds to keep the cattle stations and political dynasties flourishing. He justified the boneyard as a necessary sacrifice for the stability of the North. The man pulled a heavy-caliber revolver from a holster, the movement fluid and practiced. Elias didn't wait for the first shot. He scrambled backward, his boots sliding on the loose scree of the mine's entrance. With no other escape route, he plunged back into the throat of the opal mine. The darkness swallowed him instantly, the temperature dropping as he navigated the narrow shafts. Above him, the sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel echoed down the hole, a rhythmic, predatory heartbeat. The antagonist was in no hurry. He knew the geography of this subterranean nightmare better than any outsider. Elias navigated by touch, his fingers brushing against cold limestone and the occasional terrifying smoothness of human remains protruding from the walls. He squeezed through a narrow crawl space, his heart thumping against his ribs like a trapped bird. Just as the beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through the dark, seeking him out like the eye of a vengeful god, a thunderous roar erupted from the surface. It was the unmistakable scream of an old diesel engine being pushed to its limit. Clara's battered truck, a rusted relic of the 80s, tore across the salt pan, kicking up a massive plume of red dust. She wasn't just driving, she was weaponizing the landscape. She slammed the heavy steel bull bar of her truck into the side of the white SUV, the crunch of impact echoing down into the mine shafts like thunder. The distraction was momentary, but it was enough to break the hunter's focus. "Elias! Now! Get out!" Clara's voice cracked through the dry air. Elias lunged for the rusted iron ladder, his muscles screaming. As he vaulted over the rim of the shaft, the antagonist fired a single, calculated shot. The bullet shattered the primary camera hanging from Elias's neck, sending shards of glass and plastic exploding into the dirt. Elias tumbled into the cab of Clara's truck just as she threw it into a violent reverse. They fishtailed across the red sand, the white SUV momentarily disabled. Elias clutched his chest, the weight of the ruined camera feeling like a heavy stone. All the physical evidence appeared to be lost. However, as Clara floored the accelerator, Elias reached into the hidden lining of his boot. He pulled out a tiny micro-SD card. He had swapped the cards minutes before his tires were slashed, a survival instinct born from years of forensic paranoia. The primary camera had been a decoy, a sacrificial lamb for the truth. He looked back at the receding figure of the man standing by the wrecks. The man wasn't chasing them. He was standing perfectly still, holding a satellite phone to his ear, his face a mask of cold, generational malice. The phone call was brief and final. By the time Clara and Elias reached the Stewart Highway, every digital node in the territory was being scrubbed. The antagonist wasn't just a man with a gun. He was a man with a network that spanned from the stations to the capital. As Elias tried to upload an image of the logbook to a remote server, the signal bars on his phone vanished. The old guard had flipped the switch. A statewide lockdown on information had been triggered, turning the Northern Territory into a digital cage. They were alive, but the truth was now a radioactive secret that the very air seemed to suppress. The city of Darwin felt like another planet, a shimmering mirage of glass and air-conditioned indifference that stood in jarring contrast to the blood-soaked silence of the interior. Elias and Clara arrived under the cover of a humid coastal night, their clothes stiff with the salt of the pans and the iron of the red dust. They sought out the bastions of the free press, believing that the truth, once laid bare, would act as a cleansing fire. But the fire was smothered before it could even spark. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit offices of the territory's largest newspaper, an editor looked at the decrypted files on Elias's laptop and then looked at the door. He didn't see a story. He saw a career-ending liability. He spoke in hushed tones about legal injunctions and the political influence of the families named in the digital logbook. To the city, the men in the boneyard were still just ghosts, and ghosts were bad for business. The rejection was a cold realization for Elias. The night patrol hadn't just patrolled the physical borders of the stations, they patrolled the boundaries of public consciousness. Realizing that the traditional gates were barred, Elias and Clara retreated to a small, nondescript internet cafe in a side alley. With Clara standing guard at the door, her eyes still sharp with a lifetime of waiting, Elias bypassed the mainstream gatekeepers. He uploaded everything to a decentralized global whistleblowing platform and mirrored the data across dozens of international forums. He tagged every photo of the remains, every departmental serial number on the confiscated items, and every name of the old guard descendants. He titled the leak, "The Dark History of the Outback, the Uncounted." By dawn, the secret was no longer theirs. The digital tide was unstoppable. Across the country, the faces of the missing began to flicker on millions of screens. In small, dusty towns and suburban living rooms, families who had spent decades in suspended grief finally had a destination for their sorrow. A woman in Perth saw her brother's silver watch, the one from Clara's backyard, and finally wept for a brother she lost in 1978. A son in Adelaide found his father's name listed in the cleansing logs of the night patrol. The tragedy was no longer a whisper in the wind. It was a roar of collective memory. Forensic teams, pressured by an international spotlight that the local officials could not extinguish, were forced to mobilize toward the abandoned opal mine. Clara sat on a bench overlooking the Timor Sea, the morning sun painting the water gold. For the first time in 40 years, the weight behind her eyes lifted. Her brother was no longer a disappeared person. He was a victim of a documented crime, a man who had existed. Elias stood beside her, feeling the hollow ache of a man who had seen too much. The boneyard was being excavated, but they both knew it was only the beginning. The map Miller had provided suggested other sites, other gardens where the night patrol had buried their secrets across the vast, inhospitable expanse. The red sand was deep and patient. Elias eventually returned to his quiet life in the archives, but the silence felt different now. He knew that beneath the official records he catalogued lay a subtext of violence that no filing system could ever truly contain. He would often find himself staring at his boots, noticing the fine red dust that still clung to the seams, a permanent reminder that he had walked through the valley of the shadow. The old guard would face inquiries and perhaps even trials, but the scars they had carved into the land would remain. The Outback remained beautiful, lethal, and profoundly indifferent to the morality of men. Look closer at the accidents in your own history. Some silences are bought with blood, and some graves are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the wind to shift. The desert remembers